Welcome. This is the second AKASHA Conversation. I'm Philip Sheldrake. I work with the AKASHA Foundation in a sort of a research function. And we are determined to invest our time and energies and resources in designing moderating for decentralized social networking. And I should qualify immediately that that's as a public good. There's no intellectual property here of any sort, just so you know. And in fact, if you do have intellectual property, let's not therefore air it in this forum, because this forum is about an open web. So AKASHA Conversations is a regular webinar exploring the critical questions of decentralized social networking, this quarter with a focus on moderating. And the kind of format we have adopted here is that we want to invite an expert to bring their awesome sauce to the game, to stimulate, to illuminate, to, I guess, set the scene for the hour that we have together. In fact, actually, we've got an hour with Joseph, who has to leave us at the top of the hour. But the rest of us, if you can stay around, will probably hang in for another 10, 15 minutes, as you'll see why in a moment. So Q1 is all about moderating. We have the opportunity to learn some lessons from existing tools, existing approaches for moderating in this session. We want to focus on community moderation, so a little bit more sort of for yourselves rather than for Facebook in February. And then we want to look at how to define the tools in March. And I guess ultimately, just in case the message is not clear, the foundation intends to fund and co-create moderating systems for decentralized social networks. Joseph received a PhD in human-computer interaction from Carnegie Mellon last year, and he's now a postdoc in the HCI group at Stanford. And I'm not going to waffle on anymore because I want to learn more about his research. Joseph, we're in your hands. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. I do have some slides to share, but hopefully I'll get through them fairly quickly. Do I have access for sharing?
Yes, you do.
All right, let me just start that up. All right, how's that? Can you see my slides?
Yes, thank you.
All right, perfect. So thank you all for having me. This is a topic that is very, very dear to my heart, given that I plan to spend about the next 40 years on it, more or less, but we'll see how long I last. And I've done research on community moderation on a variety of platforms, Discord, Twitch, Facebook groups, Reddit, and some others coming along. And I am going to just preview or summarize some of the core pieces of that. So I'll get started. So before I dive into the actual research, I want to tell a little bit of a story. Communitree was one of the very first online social spaces. It was created in 1978. It's an electronic bulletin board system, which you can sort of imagine is a mix of an email list and a threaded kind of Reddit type conversation. The very first post on the platform was, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." That's a Stuart Brand quote for anybody who knows internet history a little bit. So they had grand ambitions, we'll say, and sort of a utopian view of what they were doing. Communitree was designed with an anti-censorship ethos. So things like it was really hard for admins to filter incoming messages or to remove them after they were posted. And any user could use control characters were basically system commands. So everybody had full access. In 1982, Apple made a deal with the US government in exchange for tax breaks to put computers into high schools. And teenagers fairly quickly found Communitree, and they did what teenagers do. They spammed every vulgarity they could think of. And Communitree was built with, I think, 300K of hard disk space, which its creators thought would last forever. But within days, it was totally overwhelmed, and they had to wipe it completely every couple of days, and within a few months it was dead. So at the beginning of the social web, gods did battle with teenagers, and teenagers won. So the reason I tell this story is not to present sort of a quaint old piece of history. This is something that we've seen repeating over and over the past 40 years or so, I guess now. We see a lot of services that kind of began very idealistic on free speech principles, and they kind of run into the reality of things like teenagers. And this pattern tends to happen in really, I think, very interesting defined steps in a row. It happens the same general way every time there's a new social app. So my research has been looking a lot into what goes wrong and how different communities and platforms and apps handle it. So, and of course, this is not just on Parler type free speech apps. This is across all sorts of different platforms. I don't know if any of you know what Roblox is. It's a sort of game platform that's extraordinarily popular among kind of teenagers in the US. But they have anybody can upload user-generated content, which of course creates moderation issues, especially on a platform for teenagers. So academically speaking, how do we talk about moderation? The language that's used is often political, sort of regulatory, legally based. So two of the most influential papers in the area have been The New Governors by Kate Klonick and Digital Constitutionalism by, I think it's Nicholas Suzer. I'm not totally sure on the name, but both of these obviously have a regulatory framing. So they imagine moderation as a legal-esque type process. And while that framing certainly has some advantages, it comes with some drawbacks. The policies tend to be legal. They tend to be universal-ish, which comes with some challenges. It tends to focus on reactive measures. So moderation to a lot of these scholars, though their work has a lot of nuance, and I don't want to oversimplify, and I'm sure they would critique my framing, but generally looks a lot like this. It starts with content, problematic content being posted, and then it ends with the content or the user being removed. And sometimes in the middle, you have another user reporting it. And something that I was really interested to find out recently is in industry and a lot of companies, proactive moderation is defined as getting to the content before somebody reports it, which is not how it's viewed in academia. But I'll get to that. My framing is that moderation is a social process, a fundamentally social process. And what that means generally is that while the more regulatory perspective might look like this, it's a bit of a overgeneralization, but might look something like this. My perspective looks a little bit more like this. We have a whole lot of things that happen before problematic content actually gets posted. So how does that manifest? We have a lot of user participation in the moderation process on lots of different platforms. You can see when talking about removals specifically on Twitch, it's a live streaming platform. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. These are statistics from its transparency report last year, I think. You can see the user rates of moderation are orders of magnitude higher than what the platform is doing. Obviously, they're doing different types of tasks, but there's a lot of user involvement in the moderation process. But that's still removal after the fact. I'll give an example from an interview I did with a Facebook group's moderator. This is rules from a leftist group. There's really, really interesting social dynamics with leftist groups on Facebook, but that's a whole digression on its own. But basically what this rule is saying is don't report content to Facebook, because if you do, our group's going to get banned. So only respond by tagging a group moderator. Basically, keep the issues within the group. Otherwise, Facebook is going to intervene and do what Facebook does. Getting zucked is the phrase. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is what happens before the content is posted. I've looked a lot at psychological factors. I'm not going to touch on that too much just for the sake of time, but in the moment, psychological factors are a big part of this. But also there's the long-standing community social factors, how the community develops over time, the norms, the rules, the standards for behavior, and also there's a broader ecosystem that's bigger than any individual community with lots of different stakeholders. So I'll look at those in turn. And generally, just to give you something to think about, a few questions. How can we leverage user social strengths to support different approaches? And I hope I'll give you at least part of an answer to that one. What are the social processes for discouraging problematic behaviors? And also, what are the organizational structures? And a lot of people don't think about moderation as fitting within an organizational structure. And it is a very strange organizational structure, but on a platform like Reddit, subreddit moderators are a group, many different groups. And Reddit, the platform, is a group that sort of kind of oversees the subreddit moderators in a certain kind of way, but there's a for-profit distinction, for-profit versus volunteer work. And I think it's a very interesting discussion to talk about the organizational structure there, which is unusual. So to begin, when I was starting my research in this area, I did a lot of quantitative work looking at large-scale data to focus on social phenomena. And after I finished that sort of line of work, I realized that I actually didn't know what moderators do. I had a whole lot of data about the actions they take, but I didn't know what it was like to be a moderator. So I went and talked to a bunch. In fact, we're talking about the community social factors now. I did 56 interviews with moderators from Twitch, Reddit, and Facebook groups, generally talking about their processes that they have for moderating and the social roles they have in their communities. And I'm going to talk about processes first, and then roles. This is the framework that came out of the interviews. I'm not going to go into depth on the methods or anything, but this is generally the different categories of things that I identified with the group over three sort of arcs. There's the arc of being a moderator, becoming a moderator, and learning over time, the individual over time arc. There's the moderation tasks, actions, and responses, which is incidents, basically. So more in the moment things. And there's the longer term arc for the whole community, which is rules and community development. And what this framework actually looks like is something more like this, but I'm not going to get into all the different categories. Basically, each of those 15 higher level categories within 3 top level processes has a whole lot of sub themes. But just a preview. It's all in a paper that I can share. I'm going to just highlight 4 high level themes here out of the 15. First, becoming a moderator. Second, moderators' responses to incidents, and then communities' responses to incidents. And finally, the external influences on governance, which is mostly the platform's influence on community governance. So what does it look like to become a moderator on a subreddit or a Facebook group or on a Twitch channel? Generally, the people who become moderators are people who've been in the community for a long time. They're people who kind of embody or really deeply understand the values of that community. So whoever is an existing administrator or the streamer on Twitch kind of identifies people that really align well with their values. There are some issues with, there's some issues with that in the long term when a group becomes more diverse, but that's a separate topic. But generally, core community members. And as part of this, they end up participating in the rulemaking process. And here's examples of how rules are displayed on Twitch, Reddit, and Facebook, alternatively, and generally different formats, but slightly similar and overlapping types of rules. The second piece is what moderators actually do in the moment. And I'm specifically focusing on tools because I think there's really interesting directions that I can talk more about for user creation of moderation tools. But basically on Twitch and Reddit in particular, not on Facebook, it's fairly easy to create your own bot. And this is a YouTube search for create a Twitch bot. And it's just the first links that come up. I tried one of these tutorials. 30 minutes was a bit ambitious. I think it took me 45, but really very simple. Twitch is actually is built on IRC, Internet Relay Chat. It is, chat rooms are just IRC chat rooms with a fancy interface. So you can connect to it with the libraries that have been around for literally 30 years. Third, what do community members' responses look like? So moderators, we often think of moderation as something that moderators do, but actually moderation is something that the whole community participates in, and moderators are aware of this. So what'll happen is that users enforce the rules of the group. They'll call somebody out. They'll either explicitly or implicitly invoke norms or rules, and that can take a few different forms. So you might see things like this on Twitch. There isn't quite as formal a way to show disapproval, but you might see somebody calling somebody else out in chat. On Reddit, we of course have the downvote, which is a slightly more passive way. And then of course, there's the angry react on Facebook. There are more active ways to call somebody out in text. And actually the effectiveness of different rebukes is something that I've looked at a little bit. It's an interesting conversation, but you can see on lots of different platforms, quotes like this one. This is one of my favorite rebukes. It's, I think, a classic example. So finally, from that framework, moderators' relationships with admins. So the response to this question, what is your relationship with platform administrators, platform trust and safety teams, was pretty much universally, we don't have one. They don't know we exist. We don't think that they've ever paid attention to our community. There have been papers written about certain moderators' relationships with Reddit, for example, from the very largest subreddits, the most trouble-causing subreddits in some cases. But the vast majority of communities on Facebook, on Reddit, and on Twitch have never spoken to an admin and think that the admins don't know that their community exists, and they're probably correct. But this is the subject of the last piece I'm going to talk about today, so keep this in mind. So basic takeaways. Moderators are committed community members. They use bots to handle simple problems. Moderation is a community effort. And there's this weird thing going on about division of labor, this organizational structure between volunteers and for-profit companies. And in fact, I've looked at each of these in turn and followed up with a research project for each of them. I'm going to talk in my remaining time about the answers to these two. So moderators' social roles within their communities and the organizational relationship piece. When I was doing interviews with moderators, one of them, a Reddit moderator, said this, and it really captured my attention, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And eventually it convinced me to do a follow-up study, which was to interview more moderators and to talk about how they see their social roles specifically through metaphors. I never really liked English classes. When I was in high school, I thought they were kind of wishy-washy, and metaphors were just this thing that existed for AP exams, but as I've gotten into research, I like them more and more. So metaphors are really, and have always been, a core part of computing. All of our interfaces are full of metaphors. All of our social spaces classically are full of metaphors for offline things. And there's a lot of really interesting stories for why that is, like the origin of the word lurker to describe somebody, which I can talk about if anybody is curious, but that's kind of beside the point. But really, metaphors are a huge part of computing. And it turns out they're a huge part of moderating too. So I did an additional 23 follow-up interviews. I got in touch with about 40% of the first round, which is pretty good because it was 2 years later. I think that's a good rate. And I asked them generally, what metaphors would you use to describe the work you do, the social role you have? And you might think, is this too abstract? Well, as it turns out, no. They had lots of metaphorical things to say. Even in the original interviews, when I went back and looked through the transcripts, totally unprompted, they'd used a whole lot of metaphors to describe what they do. So here's a couple of examples: being a curator as a moderator, being a diplomat, and here's a whole lot more examples. This is the framework that I ended up coming up with, which is the centerpiece of this paper. I think it's was it 22 or 23? I can never remember. Somebody can, well, 22, I think. Different metaphor categories split into 5 kind of high-level categories. And there were, of course, more metaphors used, but this is the distillation down into as discrete types of categories as we could come up with. This isn't intended to imply that each moderator picks a single different metaphor that they most identify with. In fact, I think the average number of different metaphors used was something like 2.5 over the full set of 79 interviews per person. So they align with different ones at different times. And I'm just going to pull out a couple of examples. I don't want to run over my time too much, but here's a few from the nurturing space. The tending metaphor, moderators tending to the space, tending to the vibe, this gardening piece again. And also imagining moderation like teaching, creating a safe environment to keep people learning. A very different angle. Should I be keeping up with chat, answering questions? Are those?
No, it's okay. We'll run through those afterwards, mate. Keep going.
Okay.
I love your
Okay.
flow. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you. A very different take on metaphors for moderation is this governing and regulating. And this came a lot from Reddit. If you know anything about the platform, it's probably not surprising that they have this sort of regulatory metaphor set for how moderators view the platform. But trying a case, more like a Supreme Court of moderators, public referenda, these are all things that moderators said. And the second one, the second quote here actually came unprompted, no metaphors prompted. That was just how they described their work. So the kind of core takeaway here is that in design of moderation tools of platforms, we often think of moderators belonging to a certain subset of metaphors, even if we don't explicitly say it. We sort of think of them as enforcers, like police style, or filtering a community, sometimes being an adult to encourage maturity among their members. And these sort of fall into 2 of the 5 major categories. But as it turns out, I think the statistic was 80% of moderators identified as metaphors from the other categories. So there really is a breadth. So the design question, and I've actually found this to be pretty generative when talking to trust and safety people, is how do we support a moderator who's doing something else, whose job is a different social role? What are the tools that we could build to support a garden moderator? And I don't know. There haven't been any good ones built yet, but there could be. Well, haven't been any particularly good ones to my knowledge. But in any case, last piece, this piece of the talk, I wrote this morning because the paper was accepted yesterday. So this is hot off the presses. I have no notes for this section. You're the first to hear it, so we'll see how it goes. But it'll be a little bit briefer, but I think interesting. So again, we have these different levels of factors, and this is more about the ecosystem piece. Discord, some of you may know of Discord or may be familiar with it. I like to joke that it's basically Slack for people who don't hate fun. It's generally that same type of interface with some differences. Discord, the company, has invested in moderation in some really interesting ways, some ways that really, I think, tend to be the kinds of things that companies could only do pre-IPO, which they currently are. They are actually one of the few companies that funds research, academic research pre-IPO when they're still on VC money. So some of their VC money is going to research. They don't make a profit, so they don't get tax deductions because they don't, well, anyway, kind of an interesting situation. But they've developed what they call a moderator ecosystem, which is, first, you can go to discord.com/moderation, and they have kind of what they call a moderator academy. It is a whole set of articles written by moderators who are like volunteer moderators who are actually paid for their time, for whatever it's worth. They were paid for writing the articles. They have an exam that you can find, and if you take the exam and pass, I think it's extremely difficult to pass because so many people have taken it. It's, well, an extraordinarily large number. But if you pass, you get kind of inducted into their inner circle of moderation. And they have a series of Discord servers, the moderator ecosystem, where regular people who are really into moderation can talk kind of on a daily basis with Discord trust and safety staff and voice their concerns. And get a heads up on what's coming and generally discuss moderation philosophy. So there's, I think, a few hundred people in this ecosystem, a few hundred volunteer moderators, and they are the most active, most philosophically engaged moderators on Discord. The thing that I want to talk about happened this past year during Pride Month. So every year, Pride Month, Discord, along with every other social platform, expects to get a wave of hate and harassment. Unfortunately, that's just the case. And that is, of course, targeted mostly towards LGBT users and the servers that they run. And that's a problem for them. Discoverability means discoverability and visibility mean good things in some ways, but also make them greater targets for hate. So what Discord decided to do this year, in consultation with some of those expert volunteer moderators, was offer an unusual type of assistance. So this is a post made by the lead of Discord's community moderation team, I think is what it's currently called, on June 1st. Announcing basically, we know this might be a difficult time for some of you in terms of your moderation workload. So let us know if you need some help. If you're experiencing any moderation difficulties, fill out this form. And what that form led to was parachute moderators. Members of this expert moderation community, these few hundred experts, volunteered to temporarily drop into the communities that had requested help. And oh, I mixed up my order a little bit. It's supposed to say 7 servers, 60 volunteers, and 1.1 million users. So those 7 servers were among some of the largest LGBT servers on Discord, and also some other servers that were holding events that had attracted a lot of hate and harassment. So this group of 60 volunteers parachuted in to support the moderation teams for the month. just temporarily. And the question, did it succeed? Well, here's why it should have failed. First of all, just talking about what I've already said today, moderators are dedicated community members usually. So outsiders who don't know the community very well, jumping in to be moderators, kind of set up to fail, maybe. Second, servers each have sophisticated processes, especially servers with kind of high volumes of hate. And a third, there are established role divisions within servers. Their moderators have different roles that they fill, and the influx of newcomers would have to be integrated into that. So did it succeed? Actually, yes, with some ethical questions, and we can talk more about that. But if we go back to these three, why this should have failed, moderators are usually dedicated community members. Well, actually they were. It was just a different community. They were dedicated members of the expert volunteer community, which meant they had a reputation, people knew them, they knew what they were getting when they asked for volunteers. Servers have sophisticated processes. Well, actually, they document them. They create, these ones in particular, create in-depth guides for how to deal with different types of problems that arise, some being actually dozens of pages of documentation. It's really fascinating that volunteers in these groups create, well, enormous amounts of documentation. And lastly, established role divisions. Well, the volunteers did specific types of tasks. They didn't jump in to govern the community. They didn't write rules. They did the types of things that are generalizable. They removed egregious hate. They removed links to malware and scams. They did the things that they kind of already knew how to do. So we see with each of these predictions for why it should have failed, they all were sort of correct, but there was a different angle that we hadn't originally thought of. So what? What's the takeaway here? First, moderation is bigger than any individual community. We often think of moderation happening discreetly on a single platform, what Facebook does, what Twitter does, but of course, all of these platforms are integrated and people move back and forth between them. And even within communities on a single platform, there's an enormous number of interconnections. And it's really valuable, I think, to look at moderation in that way. So to sum up, there is no social technology that's going to fix humans. And we've seen that just over and over and over again for the past 40 years. But some will be prepared for us. Some technologies, some social technologies will be aware of the history, aware of the social dynamics, and they'll be ready. So thank you.
Well, thank you for trying to condense years of research and insight into less than half an hour.
I'm aware I went a little bit over.
Oh, no.
I haven't tested the timing of this one yet, so.
To be honest, the wonderful thing about this format is we just get a glimpse of the expanse of the problem space through your eyes. You can't rock up and provide the answers because nobody has the answers, but that's getting me a nice segue into my first question to you, sir, which is, if you had to describe in, if you like, aligned with what is generally known as a Western culture, if you had to describe an ideal social network, a normative approach to moderating in that social network, what kind of words, phrases, concepts, pictures come to your mind?
It's a good question. It's a big question, but I do have some thoughts. I don't know that I can describe the kind of the full architecture of a single one, but I can describe attributes that it would have. The first is context sensitivity in moderation, which is something that the big social platforms have largely failed at so far. They have universal rules for very not universal contexts. and the platforms that have sub-communities that each make their own rules sort of address this in some ways by allowing a lot more context into moderation decisions. There's plenty of nuance in that, of course, and ethical questions, which we may get back to. The second piece would be active lines of communication between different stakeholders, different communities. If it is a more hierarchical platform, connections between different levels. And that again is, there's a common theme here. The large platforms have failed at most everything I'm going to talk about. They failed at this largely in building in ways for people to connect between communities and share knowledge. Basically, every community that doesn't have connections writes its rules from the start. They don't have any history to work from or expertise necessarily. And on pretty much all of these platforms, the ways for users to communicate with the platform employees are poor or ad hoc at best. So better communication within an ecosystem broadly, and kind of an understanding that there is an ecosystem that is important in lots of different ways. I guess there's so many more pieces I could add there, but I don't want to spend the next 15 minutes just talking about that one question. So we can maybe come back to that if there's follow-ups.
I do have a follow-up question, but hey, if anyone else has got any questions, please either just wave at the camera or put that little wavy hand icon up that Zoom allows you to do, then I can come to you. I was just wondering.
Yep.
You just muted.
So, shit, he's muted. I don't know. I
have to moderate that exclusive out, I have to say, seriously. We have clearly, in the non-digital sense, not arrived at anything approaching perfection to analog social networking in community and society, right? I mean, every local culture, every community has its qualities, and there's always somebody who believes it's not working for them, right? So there is
human social interactions are messy.
So I'm just wondering,
kind of the way we are.
I'm just interested whether you think that digitalized social networking could only get to the heights that we've been able to achieve without digital mediation, or are you a sufficient optimist that you think perhaps not only could we get there, which is of course challenging enough as it is, but go further?
So yes and no. Better in some ways, maybe not as good in others, but we'll see on the latter part. I think one of the classically touted virtues of online social spaces is the ease of moving between communities. So in a sort of cyber libertarian sense, if you don't like a community, just go find a different one or make your own. Whereas if you're unhappy with your town, if you feel like you're isolated, nobody understands you, it's a little harder to just move somewhere else. So there's that flexibility in online social spaces. There is a caveat there, which I've been wondering a lot about recently, which is what that means for community development. If the people who don't like a space just leave, does that mean that the community loses the sort of deliberatory processes that it would engage in and the kind of productive arguments and productive conflicts? So of course, there are lots of communities that do find ways to have those, but I wonder how much we lose in exchange for freedom to move everywhere. And that's an open question. I haven't found an answer to that yet. I have a saying which I've been trying for a long time to make a thing, hasn't caught on yet, but maybe you all can help, which is that echo chambers got the bad rap that virality deserved. Echo chambers on the internet are actually, in a lot of ways, kind of fantastic things. Of course, again, they're problematic ones, but having a community of people who share your interests, who you can talk with and connect with, is a fantastic thing. And it is a very different experience from being on a network with everybody. And we've seen some problems with the latter, obviously. That's not to say that, well, I won't caveat everything I say. You can just assume that there are edge cases and so on for everything. But
yeah, I like that. That's
basically, the gist of it is echo chambers maybe deserve a second look.
I like that. That's a bit of a brain harpoon that's gone in and that's going to stay in. I'm going to think about that one. Bobby, you have a question?
Hi, really fascinating work, and really great to hear about the depth of it, right? And I really appreciate it. And I was wondering, okay, from working in industry close to the content moderation process for big platform companies, right? It's just hard to ignore, right, the sort of level of automation that's used in it. And I was wondering about your thoughts on actually two different and quite separate things, but one is contestability, right? Sort of, and I was wondering, you did talk a little bit about organizational structures that are most effective, right, to responding to problematic behavior, but okay, what does that mean in terms of contestability? And like, how do you imagine, like, I don't know, like, how could we do this better?
Yeah, you really, I was gonna say something, but you really pointed it out. I didn't really talk about automation at all in this piece, and that's obviously hugely important, and an increasingly important topic of discussion, and deserves even more attention than it's getting. I am a pessimist realist on the need for automation. It's terrible, but we need it in some forms. There just is not realistically a way. And we see it user-developed automation tools all the time. Users create their own bots, and that's actually something that I've been studying. I promise I will actually answer your question. I'm getting there. Just an intro, because I'm super excited about this space. Twitch as a platform went through what has come to be called a series of hate raids in the fall, which was large-scale bot attacks against creators, particularly Black and LGBT creators. So thousands of bots spewing hateful comments. And Twitch as a company could realistically not launch a tool within 3 days of this starting, because it takes a little while to build stuff. Though there are arguments about whether they should have been prepared for this in the first place, but that's separate. But the fantastic thing that happened, I think, is that users built tools actually within 3 days to respond, to identify the bots, to remove them. And they weren't perfect. They weren't something that a company could deploy and say, this is it, we're finished. But they were more than good enough for the people who used them. They had some false positives, but generally the people who used them were okay with that given the circumstances. So users were able to build that. So I think in looking towards automation, even in those cases, the contestability of those decisions is rather low, because bots, the good bots, were literally banning tens of thousands of accounts, sometimes per day. It was an enormous number of bots that were being created. So if you were on that list incorrectly, it would be hard for you to manage. But I think organizationally, though, there is a really interesting path towards customizable automation to a certain extent. This is something that somebody in my lab has been working on a lot, and just recently published a paper. about basically, if you know generally about machine learning is based on training data. Lots of examples of prior decisions. My lab mate has built a machine learning system where you pick the people who trained the data, basically. So you pick the people who you think best understand your context, and then take their ratings as training for your algorithm. It's still not hugely transparent, but it is hopefully a little better. And generally, moderators that he surveyed are cautiously optimistic about that. So that's one case. Does that sort of start to answer your question at least?
Yeah, thanks.
But Bobby, this is your field of expertise. I'm dying to know if you'd like to respond to that in a little bit more.
For contestability?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, I think I've been looking into that, like experiences of people who've been deplatformed or, and you mentioned like marginalized communities already, right? And like some of the impacts that they're experiencing in terms of like on the receiving end, but also like I feel, especially like big tech platforms, right? The way that some of that automation works, and it does not give people any like alternative dispute mechanism, right, to dispute such decisions. And I think, yeah, we need better, like maybe socio-technical, right, structure around this. And I wanted to bring up one more question though, like kind of moving it to a little bit different direction, but part of what I'm like specifically working on is related to well-being of content moderators. And I was just curious about that angle, like, and if you thought about that, because it's just fascinating to see, especially in the case of like big tech companies, right, that are using like, I mean, thousands of people as content moderators, right? So I was wondering, like, how is that a job that a person like gets excited about in the morning, right?
Especially if you use the metaphor piñata. I mean, that does not sound like an aspirational life choice.
One of my favorites. And I'm going to use that question, thank you, as an excuse to talk about ethics, at least for the last 5 minutes, which, well, you could, I'll forward the paper, but just briefly, there is this really weird question in the Discord case of the fact that Discord, a for-profit platform, even though they're not making a profit yet, but they're for-profit, their response to a major moderation challenge on the platform was to coordinate volunteers. And you might look at that and think, isn't that maybe just a little bit exploitative? Well, maybe. And that is something that I really pushed on in interviewing those moderators. I interviewed moderators that were part of the effort, both existing in the servers and the ones who parachuted in. And I've really wanted to get them to say that they felt exploited, but they wouldn't. In two successive interviews, in their original and follow-up interviews, I've really tried to get them to say they felt exploited, but they didn't. And their reasoning was generally, first, logistically, not possible for Discord to hire enough people to moderate all the communities. But even if they could, they wouldn't want that. The moderators wouldn't want that because if the choice is between being allowed to moderate their own communities and not being allowed to moderate their communities, they strongly prefer the former, even if it means an enormous amount of volunteer work for them. They're passionate about their social spaces, and being able to do the work they do is generally a plus for them, which is a strange labor arrangement, but it is one that I think deserves serious ethical treatment beyond what is often sort of the academic conversation baseline, which is just exploitative. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But with regard specifically to moderator well-being, this was the segue. the response, I talked about that a little bit with moderators, and some of these volunteers are exposed to some of the same content that commercial content moderators are exposed to, though much less frequently and much less constant. But they do get sent pictures of really terrible gore and child abuse material and so on, the usual horrific parts of the internet. They get those, and they were surprisingly nonchalant in interviews about that's just sort of part of the job. But one moderator did say, well, it would be nice if we got access to some of the same mental health resources that the commercial content moderators are at least ideally provided, though not in all cases. So the labor the volunteers do is incredibly meaningful to them, usually, but it comes with what honestly could be the basis for trauma in the long term, and they're not really getting any formal support for that. So I guess that's the best I've got in 4 minutes.
We are approaching the top of the hour, which I think is the time we have Joseph with us. You have to disappear onto probably the first of 8 Zooms in your day. So thank you for investing the time with us. We'd love to catch up with you again in the not too distant future, not least as we embark on our first design sprint to see how we can begin this journey. And I think everybody here probably realizes that it is a journey. You never get to the destination, right? We're never going to find the solution. If anybody says, hey, we're looking for the moderating solution, I think they don't quite understand the complexity here. So, but hey, obviously we'd like to continue for another 5-10 minutes to talk about how we're going to design this design sprint, how we're going to bring it together. But Joseph's got to go, so I wondered if we can show him our appreciation in that old-fashioned way. Thanks, mate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to talk.
Okay, catch up with you soon. Thanks a lot. Hey, so Martin, we have a design sprint starting, and how do we coalesce around that? How do we bring others to that?
Yeah. So, well, one of the things that I held myself back when I thought we're gonna have another call with Joseph for sure. So that's why I didn't say it. One of the things that I realized in Joseph's presentation was that, I mean, it seems to depend a lot on the way that we design it, this moderating system, how people will see themselves, for instance, in it, also in their role, right? That's quite interesting. That's one of the things that I took from it. The second one was that this problem with the automation is one that didn't occur to me at all. And this again it depends a lot on how we will see the platform or the community or the tool that we are building and for what type of community it is. You know, it's a big question I still have as a question mark. Do we really see this problematic content, for instance, for moderators coming up anywhere, or is it so much dependent on the size of the network as well? You know, that are, for instance, two things that we might explore in the very beginning of this this process. Just before I didn't answer your question, Philip, but I just said what was on my mind.
No, it's. I think the challenge, as far as I see it, given the context of AKASHA's vision for a decentralized social networking, is understanding what we mean by decentralized. From my perspective, decentralization is not the ends. That's not the goal. That's a means to the end. We still have to articulate what the end might look like, might feel like, what behaviors are conducive that we're working towards, what values underpin the way in which we've described that destination that we can just point to over there on the hills, as we then use aspects of decentralization in the architecture of the technical code, the social code, as we can, because there are aspects of our technology at AKASHA which are still necessarily centralized. No one has worked out, for example, how to index content for discoverability in a decentralized fashion. So we have this blend of partly centralized, partly decentralized technical code. And I imagine we'll see the same with the social code. And to me, it's how the two will weave together from the first design sprint, because they are co-evolving.
Yeah. So there's one. So to the process maybe first. So what we plan is definitely in the first week, and maybe it's gonna take a bit longer than that to really, I mean, that's what we've written, understand the problem, right? So we will sketch out basically through presentations like the one that we have here, that we recorded, that we refer also participants to, what really the problem is that we try to solve. We need to maybe boil it down to a specific tangible initial question and or community that it's kind of something tangible that we need for sure, that we start with, and that can evolve over time, right? And then we need to agree that these are the things that are in scope and out of scope for the first round, and from there we'll evolve that. There are, and now coming back to more what you also mentioned there are a number of questions that we really don't know at the moment. We want to build a new type of decentralized social network. What does that really mean? Will it, for instance, create what Joseph mentioned there, these communities that will just say, well, if you don't agree with that, just fork and like fork off, create your next own community. We don't care if you don't like what we do here.
An automated approach might actually moderate that comment out, because they may have, the automated approach might have misunderstood what you said there, but we all understood that you said fork.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. That's it. I said fork. Yeah. And yes. And then yeah, so will this happen, or will we have a rather like a group of, like we've seen that for instance in the Ethereum community, like they're very technical, they're discussing very specific topics. It would be very bad for the individual to be deplatformed or being forced to leave. You know, individuals could really take harm from the fact that they are being removed from such a thing. And for that, we need to have these more the layers of governance that we discuss. I mean, we begin with moderating, but there is also the entire aspect of what is this, what we call now currently a world, like an entity that's running on the framework that we are building. I mean, how is this governed? What can we do to restore? We had last time a talk about a restorative approach to moderation as well, right?
Yes, Dr. Amy Hassanoff was awesome about that.
So, well, that's kind of the whole thing. We'll hopefully go into detail. I am very concerned that it's gonna be, it would be like an entire week to just frame the problem. And
it is. I think it's we shouldn't get too scared at the size of the challenge. We should just boldly make progress and learn from our inevitable mistakes along the way. I am conscious of time, and I would love to just have a quick round for those who are still hanging in on the call, just to get your reflections of this conversation in, I don't know, 10 seconds, 60 seconds, however long you'd like to take. Who would like to go first? Shall I just name a name?
I'll go.
Hey, Ben, thank you.
I found it interesting how Joseph was referring to how echo chambers can actually be positive, and they deserve a second look, because what I always hear, obviously, is that echo chambers are very bad, that they reinforce wrong narratives and you don't get outside input. So that was something interesting to hear. And also the idea of forking communities will result in a loss of a productive debate that could happen.
I like that. Yes, the forking is a biological process. It happens in DNA code. It's part of generativity of biological processes, but at the same time, dialogue necessarily involves dissensus as well as consensus. So there is that. I guess we could say that we're looking for slightly echoey chambers sometimes and slightly less echoey chambers the other time. I don't know. It is a conversational challenge. Any other reflections?
I can go next. I was particularly interested in one of Joseph's slides. It was the one with the framework with the different moderator engagement processes. So of course, because I currently am one of the moderators on Ethereum World, the social network that we're trying to initiate at AKASHA. And it was very comprehensive. It had the whole moderator journey, a lot of the processes that can be implemented. And the question I didn't have the chance to ask him was, when we're at the very early stage of community building, on which processes should we put our focus on? Because obviously we don't have the resources to take on each one of those processes from his framework. So in terms of prioritization, where do we put our focus on?
Well, I'll be sure to route that question to him and see if we can
and
get a response.
I would love to have the slides as well. But
and we will blog about that for sure. That question and the slides in this session, definitely. Thanks, Wasim. Anything else? Bobby, I've just seen you unmuted.
Yeah, these are really great points. And for me, I guess kind of going back to that balance with using automation tools that are either built by the platform itself or communities within the platform, right? Like, and whether like you're going to allow for people to build their own, some sort of like automation tools, like for the community moderators, and what does that look like, right? And then how do you, I guess, going back to this like question on like governance, right? And how, like, who's going to moderate the way that those kind of automation works, right? And kind of oversight, right, for any sort of automation that's used in the content moderation process. Like, what would that look like? And then I'm still actually a lot thinking about the sort of well-being question and this sort of like in terms of like mental well-being for content moderators, right? And how do you really create an environment that's really mission-driven and helps, like kind of empowers, right, people who are doing this kind of work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any more? I can wrap up. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. In that case, I will just add a last comment from my perspective, which is I'm fascinated by the digital mediation and augmentation of human identity, as some of you will know. And I'm always intrigued by the analog social networks approach to identity. The fact that when I walk into my coffee shop, they know it's me again, even though they don't know who I am, if you know what I mean. I don't go in there with my ID card out, but it's this space and it's recognizable in that particular context. The way they see me, the way I see them, it's very natural. Everybody on this call knows what that means. But of course, as soon as we hide behind a enduring anonymous account in a social network, we lose some of the social inhibitions that actually serve the real world very well. So how does generative identity or approaches to digital identity that don't require the KYC process just to have a conversation, a KYC process being know your customer, where you effectively demonstrate this is my legal identity as opposed to just, hey, it's me. That would be a dystopian extrapolation of bureaucratic identity. How can we get this balance between anonymity and legal identity so that it feels as natural in a digitally mediated environment as it does in the real world? So I'm definitely going to keep plugging away at that problem space. But that's it for today's AKASHA conversation. Number 2's in the bag. We're hoping to get these up on YouTube and in our blog, of course, and hope to see you for the next one. Also look out for more information about how you can join the first moderating design sprint. Thanks all. Take care. Have a super rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Bye. See you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.